Good day, everyone. I am Charles. Today, I will be explaining to you Michael J. Sandel's Justice and the Good under his book Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. This particular topic is a critique against the Rawlsian claim on the primacy or supremacy of justice. Let us begin. In the book, Michael J. Sandel assessed or examined the Rawlsian claim on the primacy of justice. But he found out that to systematically assess or examine such claim, it needs a certain conception of moral subject. Hence, the first step is to examine Rawls' moral subject using Rawls' moral theory as a whole. Since under Rawls' moral theory are the conception of the right as well as the conception of the good, it is prerogative to also examine Rawls' moral subject in connection with his conception of the right as well as the good. And the last part of this report is to examine the claim, the primacy of justice itself, and on whether it is supported or completed by Rawls' theory of the subject. Michael J. Sandel laid out particular metrics of assessment or examination. The first is consistency, the second is plausibility, and the third is completion. On the first metric, we ask the question: is the moral subject consistent and coherent with the moral theory and the conception of the right and of the good? On the second metric, plausibility, are the theories and conceptions plausible in general? And on the third metric, the completion, we ask the question: does the moral subject complete Rawls' claim on the primacy of justice? But before we proceed, let me introduce to you who Michael J. Sandel is. Michael Joseph Sandel is an American political philosopher and the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Professor of Government Theory at Harvard University Law School, where his course Justice was the university's first course to be made freely available online and on television. In general, Michael J. Sandel posits a communitarian critique against Rawls. To continue, let us now examine Rawls' moral theory. Rawls' moral theory is highly deontological and liberal. Thus, it considers the interlocking claims of moral theory and philosophical anthropology as its basis. It is important to put in mind that since Rawls' moral theory is highly deontological, it requires a notion of community, which I will be tackling later on. But for now, let us focus on the correspondence between Rawls' moral theory and the theory of the subject. Under Rawls' moral theory are his very own conception or moralities of the right and of the good. The Rawlsian morality of right is understood as the bounds of the self, or the distinctions present in the self, things that distinguishes the self from the other selves. Second, the morality of the good refers to the unity of those selves. What connects those selves? The unity of persons. It is important to remember that epistemologically and morally, it is always prior that the self is a separate entity first and then an entity that is connected to other selves. In entirety, Rawls' moral theory always posit that right is prior to the good, separate is always prior to being connected, plurality over unity, self over ends, since its interlocking claims of moral theory and anthropology are the basis of such Rawlsian moral theory. Now, in connection with the theory of the subject, both morality of right and morality of the good has always their own connection with the theory of the subject. On the morality of right, it sees the subject or the self as the distinct constitutions of its bounds. While in the morality of good, it sees the subject or the self as a united entity, how its bounds may be negotiated or traversed. In other words, the morality of the right sees the self with particular parts, while the morality of the good sees the self or the subject with such parts or with those parts that are united or put in one entire entity. The morality of the good consists of two parts. Part 1, Rawls' theory of community and its account of how antecedently or originally individuated persons come to join together in social union. The part 2 of the morality of the good in connection to the theory of the subject is that the theory of agency and the account of how subjects of possession bounded in advance or come in advance to acquire their purpose and ends. J. Sandel criticized this distinction or description of the self because it is difficult in practice to observe their distributive features without also remarking their internal connections, since the subject or the self is composed of two general features under the Rawlsian conception, which is its distinctness and its unity. Now, we have a problem when it comes to Rawls' conception of the subject or the self. What is it? The problem is that principles of justice spilled over the bounds of antecedently individuated subject and relied in advance on a form of unity reserved by Rawls to the province of the good. The moral theory of Rawls includes primarily the difference principle. However, this difference principle requires a wider subject of possession and not just subjects or subjects that are individuated or connected only to a certain extent. This subject of possession also requires certain theories of community and agency at the foundation of justice and not only at its parameters. Now, our only resort, as what Michael J. Sandel has laid out, is to assess Rawls' theory of good, which necessitates a theory of community and agency. In assessing Rawls' theory of the good, it is important to put in mind that, that the basis or the premise is to know whether this theory of the good is a complement rather than a prescription or a prescriptive force of the theory of justice. Before we go on with the need for an established subject of possession, we need a clear description of Rawls' subject or the Rawlsian description of the subject or of the self. It goes like this: no person or race can be inherently more worthy or deserving than another, not because all are intrinsically worthy and deserving, but because none is intrinsically worthy or deserving, and so all claims must equally await the arrival of just institutions. So according to Rawls, if someone has an attribute of being super intelligent, of being so strong, of being so fortunate that he or she comes from a rich families, those advantages are arbitrary from a moral point of view. Also, this description of the Rawlsian subject is anti-meritocratic, which means that the concepts of merit and virtue and moral worth have no antecedent or pre-institutional moral status whatsoever, and so cannot provide an independent standpoint for which otherwise just institutions could be criticized. In addition, moral worth, according to Rawls, is secondary only to right and justice, since it plays no role in the substantive, definitive distribution of shares. So, it implies that particular individuals have these attributes, and this in turn should be shared to the community so that it will become or will be really considered as practically common assets. However, there is really a need for a wider subject of possession since it reconstitutes power and restore power in a certain setup. And this need or this necessity for a wider subject of possession would help Rawls' notion of common assets to be served for general social ends or the common good rather than the individual ones. So in other words, it is for the common good that an establishment for wider subject of possession is needed. Because if there will be no subject of possession, those individual attributes present in every self, in every person, has the tendency of being used for their own personal interests. Hence, the response of Rawls is the intersubjective description of common asset. However, this has the tendency, this notion or this description of common asset, this has the tendency that unless there is already the established subject of possession, i.e. the notion of community, it will really contradict the Kantian or Rawlsian injunction against first, using some as means to other ends, and second, relaxing altogether the bounds of the self and the other, leading to a radically situated subject. So now, what should Rawls do, or where do we go from this utterly constricting situation? We must proceed to examine Rawls' theory of community on whether it completes the principle of justice as required and also account for the virtue of community generally, on whether his notion of community holds water for his common assets and reasonably and properly establish his theory of the subject.